From the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, this is Prosperity That Works with Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. Here, Dr. Purnell explores the evidence for shared prosperity as a smart economic strategy. In this episode, Dr. Purnell unpacks the link between opportunity and geography with renowned economist Dr. Raj Chetty. Dr. Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and the Director of Opportunity Insights. He also served as the keynote speaker at the 2025 St. Louis Economic Mobility Summit and made time for this conversation while in St. Louis. What can a person's neighborhood mean for their opportunities to build a better life? How can we make sure more people have the chance to chase their dreams? And what could that mean for the entire region? Digging into those questions and more, here are Dr. Purnell and Dr. Chetty.
Welcome, Dr. Raj Chetty. It's so great to have you with us here in St. Louis, here at James S. McDonald Foundation. Welcome.
Terrific to be here, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I want to dive right into the meat of your work. And part of what you have found, you and your collaborators and colleagues have found, is that place matters quite a bit. The context in which young people grow has outsized impact on their later economic performance. So can you talk about when you first started looking at this place effect, what was most surprising to you?
So 10 years ago, Jason, the way I started in all this was interested in how you can help people rise up and achieve the American dream. And lots of people have been interested in those questions for decades, right? How can we help people become more productive, achieve their potential? Our team at Opportunity Insights, myself, we're by no means the first to be studying these questions. Our angle on it is to use large-scale modern data, big data, so to speak, to study these questions in the same way that big data is used in the private sector by companies to improve the products they offer. Our vision is those kinds of data can be really helpful to understand things like the science of economic opportunity, what helps people thrive and achieve better outcomes in their life. And one of the first things we did when we got access to very large-scale data, anonymized tax returns covering everybody in the American population, linking kids to parents, allowing us to map people back to exactly where they grew up and see how they did in their lives, is we made this map of the geography of upward mobility in America. This was about 10 years ago. And it was a simple idea. It said, let's take kids growing up in St. Louis, take kids growing up in Detroit and Charlotte, all around the US. And suppose you've got a kid growing up in a low-income family, say a family making $30,000 a year. Let's follow them over time and ask, how much are they making themselves when they're adults, when they're in their 30s, as a simple measure of upward mobility. And it turns out, and I remember seeing that first version of the map, that the answer to that question varies greatly depending upon where you're growing up. In some cities, some places like rural Iowa, for example, if you're growing up in a low-income family making $30,000 a year, on average in the next generation, you're making $50,000, $55,000 a year. A lot of upward mobility for a community in a single generation. Yet there are other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, unfortunately like St. Louis, where kids starting out at that exact same family income level aren't really doing much better than their parents were 30 years later, don't have great chances of rising up. And so that was a first indication that if somebody asks you, is the American dream well and alive? Do people have good chances to rise up in this country? You can't actually answer that question because the answer depends a great deal on where you're growing up. That is, place seems to matter.
Were there surprises like why rural Iowa versus what people would assume? Cities have been these great engines of economic growth and economic opportunity for hundreds of years. What accounts for some of that variation?
Yeah. So, the reason I mentioned rural Iowa and it sticks in my mind is exactly because it's surprising, right? If you were to ask me before I looked at the data, where is the land of opportunity? Nebraska, Iowa would not have been the first places I would have suggested to you. Now, one thing to note is when we say place, what we're focusing on is where kids grow up, not necessarily where they live as adults. And so a number of the kids, particularly in rural areas who are doing really well and have reached the highest rungs of the income and economic ladder, they've moved to Chicago, they've moved to New York. And the beauty of these data is you're able to continue to see how they're doing as they move to different places. So part of it is that Iowa, and more generally what we find is, some places are really good incubators of talent. It's where you grow up that really seems to matter for your life outcomes, from something like birth to early adulthood. We find that when people move to different locations when they're adults, it has some impacts, but not nearly as great as growing up in a different environment. And so the key, really, we've done a series of analyses looking at people who moved to different areas, looking at randomized experiments where people were given vouchers to move to different neighborhoods. And it's very clear that the earlier you move to one of these places where we see people thriving, to one of these opportunity areas, the better you yourself do in the long run. So the question then becomes, as you know, what's the secret recipe? What's the secret sauce? What makes Iowa different from other places? Um, and since we started to put out those data publicly, and anyone, by the way, can look at these data at a website, opportunityatlas.org, where you can type in your home address and look down to the block level. How are kids growing up in your neighborhood doing? That kind of data has, in the past 10 years, created essentially a new field of studying economic mobility and its determinants, where our team, Opportunity Insights, and many others have used these data to try to answer your question. Is it about differences in schools? Is it about differences in the types of jobs, transit, the density of the area, who you're connected to? There are numerous different factors that people have looked at. Just to summarize, briefly, some of the most important determinants, we tend to highlight 4 strong predictors of economic mobility across areas. One, as you might expect intuitively, is the quality of schools, both at the K through 12 level and access to higher education. The second is rates of poverty. So we find that more mixed income communities tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. If you're growing up in an area where everyone is very poor, concentrated poverty, we see that kids there have poorer chances of rising up. A third key factor, strongly predictive, is family structure. We find that places with more two-parent families in particular tend to be places with higher rates of upward mobility. And then finally, Jason, we find that places with more social capital tend to have more upward mobility. Now, social capital can mean many different things. We have found that one particular aspect of social capital, how connected you are to higher income people, measured actually using Facebook data, the fraction of high income friends that low income people have, tend to be places, where you have more of those connections, you have much higher rates of rising out of poverty. So let me just come back to Iowa. Iowa, if you think about those 4 factors, actually excels on many of those dimensions. It's the kind of place where if you're a low-income kid, many of your friends in the local public school, because everybody goes to the same school, maybe from higher income backgrounds, you have that kind of cross-class interaction. You don't have extreme rates of poverty. Traditional sense is you have pretty good schools. And so some of the patterns start to make sense when you see these factors as being important.
So what this makes me think about, we've been having probably as long a conversation in St. Louis as your original study, uncovering kind of the geography of opportunity just within the St. Louis region. So it is possible to drive or walk a couple of miles and experience a very different social and economic milieu. And we know that that has impacts on children's upbringing and their life outcomes. Do you observe the same kind of variation within local areas? And can you talk about the kinds of drivers like residential segregation, those geographies?
Yes. So after the initial study we did, which really was comparing across different metro areas and different cities, we then were able to zoom in over time and look at the data down to the census tract level, neighborhood by neighborhood in every city in America. And what surprised us there was that actually the story is not really about Iowa versus Missouri or St. Louis versus Boston. It's actually about different neighborhoods within a given city, where exactly as you noted, in most cities, St. Louis included, you can walk a couple miles down the road, and it's equivalent to going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So the variation is really emerging at a hyper-local level. Kids have very different prospects, sometimes depending upon which side of the street they live on, which may determine which school they go to, who their peer group is, and so on. And so one of the things we find is that highly segregated cities, which in effect mean that poor people, lower income people are living in concentrated poverty. That's another way to say the city is highly segregated. those kinds of places tend to be places where it's very difficult for children to rise up. And I think the mechanism, one important mechanism, is that those kids don't end up having exposure and connections to people from different backgrounds who may provide access to resources, jobs, internships, inspiration to pursue career paths they may not have otherwise considered. We find that that kind of segregation at a very local level is extremely important.
I want to ask about a study you did several years ago that ended up on the front page of the New York Times with an animated graphic that showed the mobility trajectory of Black males in particular, and quite a bit of downward mobility, even in the highest income groups. They grew up in higher income groups or settings and families, but actually experienced downward mobility. And the finding that really stood out for me, one of them was that, living in less segregated areas certainly was predictive of better outcomes, but also just the presence of fathers. And it didn't need to be that child's father, just the presence of any fathers. Can you talk more about that particular study?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've focused so far on how place matters, but race also matters in addition to place. Both matter. And what we find is even within a given area, there are very different prospects for Black kids and white kids in particular. And there's an interesting interaction with gender. So it turns out white and Black men have very different rates of upward mobility, rising up out of poverty, and very different rates of downward mobility, which you were emphasizing, starting out in a high-income family. Unfortunately, Black men are much more likely in the next generation to fall down the next generation to the middle class or even the lower end of the income distribution, whereas as a white man, if you're born to a high-income family, you tend to float at the top of the income distribution. It's relatively unlikely you end up moving down significantly. And so, we find that both of these factors are very important. For Black kids as well, the neighborhood in which you're growing up is very important. Characteristics of your local community are highly predictive. One particularly important factor, turns out, for Black men is the number of Black males among the adults who are in the neighborhood, who are employed. Employment rates among Black fathers, for example, are a strong predictor of rates of upward mobility. And that echoes a broader finding we have in general across populations, not just for Black men, for white folks as well, for girls, for boys, that the strength of the community in which you're growing up, as reflected in the previous generation of people like you, is a key predictor of economic mobility. Now, why is that? I think the most plausible mechanism is kind of a role modeling or exposure mechanism, where if you have seen you could see yourself in the footsteps of somebody who's pursued a certain career path, has gone to college, has gotten a job in a certain sphere, that can give people access directly to referrals, internships, direct paths to success, but also inspires them to pursue those paths. Whereas if, unfortunately, as you have for Black boys, you have a phenomenon of missing Black men in many neighborhoods due to incarceration, due to, most unfortunately, death at premature ages. There are many Black boys growing up in neighborhoods where there's no one to look to of that type. And I think that is one important reason you see persistence of poverty and some of these challenges persisting for Black men in particular.
Yeah, and there's this almost perverse outcome of desegregation. So I think of the kinds of neighborhoods that my parents grew up here in St. Louis. You had the socioeconomic diversity that you're talking about. You had kids across the spectrum going to one of our storied high schools, Sumner High School, and being taught by people who had PhDs because there weren't any other opportunities for those educators. And there was this intermixture in terms of socioeconomic status. And you find that post the 1960s, the people who could vacate the central city moved out into St. Louis County and other places. And what was left behind very often was that kind of concentrated poverty that you're talking about. So you almost have this unintended consequence of an opening up of opportunity that ends up geographically sorting people who might have helped stabilize other places.
And very consistent with that, we find that the key predictor really is income integration. that cross-class interaction may or may not be between racial lines, but if you're connected to people who are higher up in the ladder at the moment, they can help you rise up as well, whatever their racial background. And so I think that focus on class integration, we have more and more income segregation in America over time. Higher income people are living in certain neighborhoods, attending certain colleges, going to certain schools. We're more separated. We're coming apart in that way. And I think that is a key impediment to economic mobility.
Yeah, how does the conversation around income inequality and probably the less frequent conversation around wealth inequality overlay with this story about economic mobility?
So in the data, we find a strong correlational pattern. It's been well documented within the US with our data across countries called that people have termed the Great Gatsby curve, going back to the economist Alan Kruger and work done by an economist named Miles Korak, where basically people have shown that countries with more inequality or areas with more inequality in a given generation are also places where it's harder to rise up across generations. Now, why is that? What we found actually more recently is the mechanism may not be what you would have thought. It actually seems to be related to these notions of social capital and how people are interacting with each other. So it's not necessarily directly the effect of income inequality in and of itself. What we're finding is that more unequal places tend to be places where there's also less cross-class interaction. Simple intuition I can give you is if you've got a lot of inequality, maybe the richest people live in gated communities, send their kids to private school, they're completely separated from lower income folks. And as we just talked about, that kind of cross-class interaction and exposure seems like a really key driver of upward mobility. So it turns out that's the key mediating factor through which income inequality ultimately affects upward mobility. We find that once you control for that degree of cross-class interaction, actually there isn't much of a link between income inequality and upward mobility. But more unequal places have more disconnection in terms of interaction, which then leads to less social mobility.
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, hosted by JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. JSMF is a private philanthropic foundation that envisions a thriving St. Louis region where inclusive growth elevates shared prosperity and quality of life. JSMF invests in organizations and initiatives focused on improving economic mobility for St. Louisans facing the starkest disparities, not as charity, but as a strategy to help build a more thriving St. Louis economy for all St. Louisans. Here again are Dr. Purnell and his guest, Dr. Raj Chetty, the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and the Director of Opportunity Insights.
We talk in science about modifiable risk factors versus those that are not modifiable. What does all of this suggest in terms of intervention? We certainly can't force people to live next to one another. You mentioned schools, but our schools are very often, the local property tax is what determines the quality of the school, and the ability to afford a home in a neighborhood where you can pay that property tax determines where your children are going to school. What can we do about all of this?
Yeah. So I think of interventions, which is, of course, where we should be headed, in two different dimensions to try to create integration. And to be clear, I think integration is one key dimension on which we can intervene, but there are other things we can do as well in the context of education, in the context of job training. So there are a number of interventions we could consider. But let's focus on integration for a moment. I like to divide it into two different approaches that I think matter. One is increasing exposure. So one reason we may not have a lot of cross-class interaction is that high-income and low-income people live in different places. They go to different churches. They participate in different activities. You can't be friends with people you never meet. So that is a problem, and we may think about how we bring people together physically. But there's a second issue which I think receives less attention, which we find to be very important in social network data that we've studied, which is what we call friending bias. Even if you and I go to the same school, live in the same neighborhood, and so on, we find that there's a lot of stratification by class, meaning low-income and high-income kids tend not to hang out with each other. If you've gone to a big urban school that may on the surface appear to be integrated, you walk around the cafeteria, can likely pick up on what I'm talking about, which is that certain kids are sitting with each other and other kids of different income and racial backgrounds are sitting with each other, and you don't actually have organic interaction. And that second notion of friending bias requires a very different set of interventions to tackle. It's not just about putting people in the same place. They're already in the same place. The question is, how do you actually get meaningful interaction? So let's talk about interventions on each of these dimensions. First, how do you actually bring people together, which is the necessary first step? And then how do you actually get them to interact? So on the first, we have found, some good success with certain kinds of interventions. A good example is housing vouchers or affordable housing programs, where rather than building a big affordable housing development in a given place, which can lead to a lot of resistance, NIMBYism, concerns about what's going to happen to property values and so on, a more decentralized approach, which we actually implement on a fairly large scale in the federal government with something like 2.5 million families getting housing vouchers from the federal government, we find that when they are supported in using those vouchers to move to higher opportunity areas, they end up thriving there. And they're able to integrate into the local communities. There's relatively little resistance because it's pretty decentralized approach. And so that's a way, at least at some scale, that we can create a bit more integration on the margin. I think there are also approaches we can take to revitalize existing communities. So very high poverty public housing projects, for instance, here in St. Louis, there was a program called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program that tore down these high poverty public housing projects and built mixed income, more welcoming communities. And we're finding that those kinds of interventions literally lead to more interaction because people feel safer. There's lower rates of crime. There's more interaction between people living in those revitalized neighborhoods and the surrounding areas. And that leads to lots of improvements in kids' outcomes down the road. So I do think there are a number of things we can do on this exposure dimension. And there are a number of policy attempts. There are other things which I think have had more mixed record of success or at least unclear evidence, like busing kids to different schools and so on. But there are a number of approaches that I think potentially have promise there. The more challenging one is addressing the friending bias issue. How do you actually get that interaction to occur? And I would like people to spend more time thinking creatively about interventions in that space. I think there's been a lot more conversation about physical integration over the years, much less about this issue of friending bias. And, while I don't have clear interventions to point to with data that have a record of success yet, there's some clues about what may matter. So one pattern we find in the Facebook data when we look at where people form friendships, we find that the friendships that people form in certain settings, in their religious institutions, in recreational settings, they tend to be much more likely to cut across class lines than the same person if you look at the friendships they form in their neighborhood, at their job, at the school they attend. Why is that? One theory is that if you have something in common with someone, a shared faith, a shared sports team, a shared interest, that brings people together in a way that crosses class lines. And so it's a clue that suggests, maybe if we can create more of that kind of programming that brings people together in communities, it can make a difference. What can that look like? Let me give you a small example. We don't know if it works yet, but it's just kind of interesting to think about what people are thinking about in this space. So Atlanta, as you may know, is a very segregated city. And the train line called the MARTA runs between the more affluent areas and the less affluent areas of the city. So they have created a new soccer league where it's an elevated train line. So they have soccer fields that they've built underneath the subway stations and created a soccer league where kids from these different neighborhoods play with each other and presumably start interacting with each other. And perhaps this is a small step towards breaking down some of those barriers. Just an example of the kind of thinking I think would be good to do more of.
So that's fascinating to me that that's the direction, because I'm a psychologist by training. And social psychology is not my subfield, but social psychology has, decades of evidence around this notion of contact.
Yes.
And, Gordon Allport's work around the conditions that are necessary to break down inner group bias. One of the most potent is superordinate goals. Mm-hmm. So giving people something to do. I often say the military is one example of this. Mm-hmm. It turns out when bullets are flying at you, you don't really care what color or gender or religion someone is. Yes. So I think it would be fascinating to look at how do you operationalize some of the insights of contact theory and the updates since the 1950s
Yes.
when Allport first created that theory, to think about how do you bring people together? How do you have opportunities to know one another as acquaintances? And very importantly, and probably most challenging for our current context, it has to be endorsed by people in leadership and people who have authority.
Yeah.
You have to feel compelled in certain ways to have this contact.
Yes.
And again, the military is a great example of that. But it's fascinating to think about, how might we apply some of those insights from social psychology when you think about this friending challenge.
And one thing I'd emphasize in that context, Jason, is, you can take one approach, which is deliberately to try to create this contact. That can be very productive if we can figure out ways, especially to do that on scale. But what I've also been finding is that in other programs that have ostensibly nothing to do with creating contact per se, a job training program, a housing voucher program, an educational program, this kind of insight that social capital, who you're connected to, really matters, can make those programs much more effective as well. So to give you one concrete example, there's a long history of job training programs in the US that really focused on what you might think of as the nuts and bolts. We're going to train you in a certain skill that's in demand. Could be information technology, could be, in recent years, AI-related tools or financial operations, whatever it is. And then now you're equipped with these skills. We're going to send you on your way and you're going to find a better job. Turns out when you look at years of evaluations of those kinds of programs, they are not effective. There's now a new wave of programs like Perscholas, Year Up, and so on, that do that kind of training, but then they layer on what I would basically think of as a social capital intervention. They connect you to an employer seeking to hire for exactly that set of skills that you're being trained in. They get you an internship at that firm. They provide wraparound mentoring services, all of which have this feel of, we're going to kind of give you that additional social support, that contact, if you will, that maybe then is going to have an effect. And it turns out those programs are vastly more effective than just the traditional job training. So I think a key thing I would emphasize is we don't need to just focus directly on the end goal of creating more contact. We can infuse that logic into other programs that we're implementing to make them much more effective.
That's so interesting. And I think a lot of our children, and even the more affluent ones, need help just socializing in general. I think COVID had a tremendous impact, particularly on children who were kind of right in the heart of their developmental stages. And, I see it in my own children. There's much more comfort staring into a screen than going outside and finding who's in the neighborhood and even planning for the weekend. What are we going to do this weekend? So there are these sort of macro trends around our social isolation. The Surgeon General's new report on loneliness that overlay onto this conversation. Can anyone make meaningful and productive connections?
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri. JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell is speaking with Dr. Raj Chetty, the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Dr. Chetty is also the Director of Opportunity Insights, whose mission is to identify barriers to economic opportunity and develop scalable solutions that empower people throughout the United States to rise out of poverty and achieve better life outcomes. You can learn more at opportunityinsights.org. Here again are Dr. Purnell and Dr. Chetty.
So one of the challenges in places like St. Louis is this, what I call magical thinking about geography. This notion that people who live in a certain part of St. Louis are inherently problems versus having potential, versus being potential contributors or resources. And we believe very strongly here at the James S. McDonald Foundation that there is talent everywhere. How do we create the conditions or make the arguments that allow people to see that it's for lack of investment, not lack of character or lack of some sort of innate characteristic that is actually determining outcomes?
So I think that's absolutely right. And the way we see that in the data most clearly, we've done a couple of studies that speak to that. where we look at who goes on to become an inventor, who goes on to become an entrepreneur by linking data on patent records, for example, to tax records to study who goes on to have a patent, a proxy for being an inventor. And it turns out, Jason, that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you are 10 times more likely to become an inventor in America than if you're from a lower income family. Now, when we dig into why that is, it's related to all the factors we've been talking about: who you're exposed to, the schools you attend, what opportunities you had, neighborhood in which you're growing up, and so on. You see that nationally, you see that here in the St. Louis data, that there's certain swaths of the city where kids' talent is just not being harnessed. They are less likely to rise up and have higher earnings, which was what we were discussing earlier in this conversation. They're also less likely to start businesses, to become inventors, and so on. And why is that latter piece very important? Because it suggests that if we were to cultivate that talent, it's not merely about helping those kids, it's about helping the broader economy, helping all of us. Those kids will discover new drugs, start new businesses that create new jobs, develop new technologies. In a sense, there's an enormous number of what we call lost Einsteins out there. We estimate that we would have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do if kids from lower income backgrounds, underrepresented minority backgrounds, and women were to invent at the same rate as high income white men. And what we find very clearly in the data is the reason those Einsteins are lost is not because of a lack of talent. In fact, if you look at achievement in earliest years in school, many of them are doing just as well as kids from more advantaged backgrounds. But then if you look at what happens over time, take 2 kids scoring at the top of their math class in 3rd grade, the kid from the high income family is far more likely to end up becoming an inventor or entrepreneur than the kid from a lower income family. And so in that sense, we have the talent there, but we're just not harnessing it. And so to me, that's a very different argument for being interested in these issues of economic opportunity. It's not just about fixing problems or an issue of fairness, all of which is very important in its own right. It's really just a matter of even economic growth. If you just want your city to thrive, you want to invest and harness that talent pool. And that is clearly doable if we have the right set of interventions.
Is it necessary that the exposure be face to face and continuous? I mean, we have this opportunity to connect with the entire world now, and our children are probably the most facile at it. Or is it sufficient to just be able to see those examples?
So it's a fascinating question. I don't think we know yet rigorously from research what the answer to that is. My sense is that intensity matters here. So what we found is in many of our interventions where we try to really support families in moving to better neighborhoods or get job training, when you do high intensity interventions where people have a lot of support, it pays off. If you try to do a light touch version where I bring you in for an informational session, show you a couple of examples of people who succeeded, people get busy with other things. They don't end up following through, as you know from being a parent, really steering people along and giving them that helping hand is as important as giving them information. Now, that being said, technology has this interesting, capacity to basically break us out of our boundaries where we're no longer constrained to interacting with people physically next to us. It, in a way, has potential to tremendously reduce segregation. And perhaps we can do that with the intensity necessary to really create opportunity. My sense is that just left unfettered, modern technology, things like social media, developments with AI, they will gravitate towards reinforcing segregation. If we look at who people interact with on Facebook, online, it's not like they're interacting with a much broader group of people than they are offline. If anything, it looks more segregated, actually, because people kind of get into their own bubbles. But I think, like with many technological changes, there's both a challenge if you don't do anything, that you might actually amplify segregation, but also an opportunity. If we develop new ways to use those technologies, perhaps there are lower cost, scalable ways with artificial intelligence to support lower income families as navigators, moving to different neighborhoods or finding different jobs, getting different educational opportunities. We don't know yet if those are going to be effective, but I think it's certainly worth investing in that space and trying to develop those tools in tandem with human interaction.
It's interesting. So, I mean, one of the hallmark characteristics of any social network is homophily, or
Yes.
birds of a feather flocking together. And it seems almost impossible to overcome that. What makes you hopeful that we can design interventions that actually have some impact?
I think what makes me most hopeful is seeing very clearly in the data that both at a small scale, there are specific programs where we can see very clearly in the data somebody who went through and moved to a different neighborhood as a result of getting a housing voucher or had a better teacher early on in school. We can follow them for 25 years and see how that changed their life. We can see, certain kinds of higher education programs, training programs. There are a variety of different things where we see concrete, measurable impact that translates into people's lives being changed. And so that gives me hope. What also gives me hope is having now studied this for more than 10 years, that Opportunity Atlas map that we started with, we're able to look at how that's changing over time. I'll give you one example that gives me a lot of hope. When we first put out that data back in 2014, Charlotte, North Carolina ranked 50th out of the 50 largest American cities in terms of economic mobility. And that was a wake up call in Charlotte. They kind of felt like we're a thriving city doing really well in the Southeast. How can it be that we're doing so badly on this measure of helping people rise up? And in a nutshell, what was going on in Charlotte is they were basically importing talent. They had lots of high paying jobs. City was much richer than it was in the past, very vibrant. But basically, people were moving to Charlotte to get those high paying jobs. They weren't bringing up their own people. And this led to a real call for action with a commission and a task force formed to bring together business leaders and policymakers and make a concerted effort to really try to do something, invest in early education programs, job training programs, Year Up, the kind of program I mentioned earlier, employers hiring differently, and so on. And perhaps partly as a result of those efforts and other broader trends in Charlotte where people have been focused on these issues for some time, in the most recent study we put out a year ago on how opportunities changed over the past decade, Charlotte turns out to be one of the places in America with the biggest improvements in economic mobility in the past 15 years or so. And so that shows at more of a macro level that change is possible. These things are not set in stone. At the moment, there might be many neighborhoods in St. Louis where opportunity is lacking, but we see other cases where that can change, and you don't have to wait 100 years for that. That can change in 10 years and 15 years if we take a deliberate approach. And that makes me very hopeful.
That makes me hopeful too, because that is the work that we are involved in here at the James S. McDonald Foundation, trying to build that civic infrastructure along with a number of our partners across sector to emulate what Charlotte and other regions have done. So that gives me a great deal of hope as well. What motivates you to do this work? How did you get into this field of economic mobility and trying to lift people's chances in the United States?
What motivates me personally is my own personal experience. It goes back to the themes of the research of exposure mattering. And so I grew up in New Delhi, India, till I was 9 years old, came to this country. Like many immigrants, saw the tremendous difference in opportunities and what you have in the US versus what's available to many people in India. In my own family, I think my interests come from going a generation back. My parents both grew up in low-income families in villages and small towns in South India. And it so happened that at that time, families didn't have enough money to educate all of their children. So they would often pick one child to complete high school, invest in higher education. And it so happened quite unusually in my mom's family as a woman that she ended up being the kid who got that higher education. And she ended up becoming the first woman to become a doctor in our community in South India, because my grandfather, her father, worked alongside Mahatma Gandhi and was kind of really into women's rights and progressive thinking at the time. And so that led to the opportunities she had. And my dad, likewise, ended up being the person who ended up having those opportunities, got the opportunity to come to UW-Madison land grant institution, where he did his PhD in statistics and economics, and that created a set of opportunities. And what I've been struck by is how those opportunities that they had have translated into differences across the generations for me relative to my cousins, who are happy in their own ways, but I can see have had very different opportunities that I and my sisters have had. As a result, I think of essentially luck that my parents had those opportunities. And so that has motivated my own personal interest. I see myself as comparable to many other kids, my cousins and many others who could be sitting here having this conversation with you. And I think I'm motivated by trying to understand how we can give more kids those opportunities.
There's a lot of parallels between what motivates us in terms of having that exposure, having those opportunities, winning the parent lottery.
Yes.
And wanting more people to have that chance to flourish. That's amazing. It's been wonderful having you here in this conversation. We're very excited that you're here in St. Louis. In preparation for your visit, I've told people I believe that Raj is one of the most consequential social scientists of his generation. So it's just an honor to be able to sit down and talk to you. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for all the work you all are doing.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, hosted by JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. Find out more about the work JSMF supports and connect with the foundation at jsmf.org. And be sure to subscribe to catch future conversations about how, together, we can build a prosperity that works for all.